You're listening to Free Will, Science and Religion podcast. My name's David Joseph, and here today I'm joined by Slattery, George Ortega, and Chandler Klebs. And today we're talking about the reason why we don't have free will. I guess would be the point of today's topic. So for me personally, it was a case of just being exposed to the fact that we have external influences, environmental influences, and we're all kind of victims to a certain degree of what we're experiencing and all the prior causes that impact on our behavior and generate new behaviors. And so for me, that didn't happen until I was about 25, 26 years old. So it's quite late, I think, compared to other people here. I know that Trick and George and Chandler all have books on this topic, and I don't. So which one of you guys wants to go first and kind of jump in?
Let's begin actually just for the sake of the audience with a definition of what most people mean by free will. Like the philosophers, confuse the issue with their, nonsensical meanings. But I think in general, does somebody want to just like present what do people what do we mean when we're refuting free will, when we're saying that we, there is no free will? So.
Yeah, I can do that. See, basically what they really mean is that they, all by themselves, of their own accord, could have chosen to do something different in the past than what they did. That they actually had a power that they could have done something different. And the main reason that this is impossible is because there would have had to have been a reason for why they did what they did, and if they had done something different, they would have had to have been a different reason, so it would have been a different universe, different situation. So that's how I came to the understanding that the type of freedom to do otherwise, type of free will, is the kind many people are believing in. And in fact, even compatibilists will often, even though they say that they believe in free will admit that we could never have done otherwise in the past. So that's the important thing, is the could have done otherwise belief.
Exactly. Yeah, I hold that same definition myself. The ability to have of one's own accord done otherwise. And the reason I put the of one's own accord is just to address indeterminism. So for those indeterministic people, those people who want to argue for indeterminism, libertarians and things like that, then we have that kind of qualifier there. But otherwise, the ability to have done otherwise in a deterministic universe is pretty much impossible for logical reasons, which we can get into those logical reasons. But that's why I don't believe in free will.
Yeah.
I've always gone with the definition of free will being something along the lines of being able to choose without influence. Is that correct, do you think?
Yeah, Dave, and actually that I think is the more conventional, popular understanding of free will. I think that the having done otherwise is something that was constructed by philosophers that isn't as intuitive. Basically, yeah, free will is like that we do what we do without anything that, and the thing is control, the key word, that without anything that's not in our control, either influencing us or compelling us to do what we do.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing, is people believe that, like, for example, there are people who they will ask for advice from their family or friends, and people say, well, we don't want to influence you. We want you to make your own choice. As if there's a person making a choice uninfluenced or being influenced, when really everybody's influenced, and so the difference is non-existent.
Right. Well, Chandler, but we have to recognize the difference between, for example, like figures of speech, manners of speaking, and literality. In other words, like if I ask you to like pick a card out of a deck that I'm holding in my hand at random, I would say that as a figure of speech, knowing there's no true randomness. So in other words, like in your example, somebody's saying like, well, make your own decision. I don't want to influence you. can you understand the pragmatic difference? So like from that context, it kind of makes sense. I don't think they're necessarily implying that you'd be making the decision without any influence at all.
Well, what's interesting about it, George, is I think the reason people are that way, though, is because they have a free will belief and believe that that person is somebody who is choosing uninfluenced, but that they'll violate their free will if they give them advice. So that's why I think that it's faulty reasoning based on a belief in free will.
Yeah. The reason I don't use the influence thing so much is only because we're influenced by a lot of internal things as well. So you know, our brain structure, for example, influences our decisions. But of course, our brain structure is influenced by other things, which is influenced by other things. So ultimately, it stems from things that are out of our influence. But it's everything's influencing us, including ourselves. So the problem with using just influence alone, I think, stems to the idea that, oh, then we're partially free, you know, because we're part of the influence. Whereas I think the otherwise doesn't run into that problem. The otherwise says that, oh, we couldn't have made a different choice and given a different situation. Same thing with if we put the otherwise in present tense, it's the ability to be able to choose between more than one viable option or action. So
yeah, Trick, and although I don't, you know, often address this, I think it was in my book. I sometimes make the case that, you know, even influence, you know, rather than complete compulsion, nullifies free will. And the example I ordinarily use is like, let's say you're, you know, a student in school and you're handed an assignment to do a report, and let's say you don't do it completely. Your parents or a friend helps you do it, right? You can no longer claim to the teacher, yes, this is my work, right? So like, because someone has quote unquote influence, let's say just like giving you some pointers or whatever. So in that same sense, you know, if we apply that to the free will, even like if it's 99% us and 1% some other influence, like our unconscious or whatever, that would negate free will, because like that would mean that 1% was actually, because it was influencing, it was necessary to the decision. So, but again, that's a
right.
subtle point.
Right.
No, yeah, I totally agree with you on that. It's just that some people might see that, you know, that 1% or whatever as saying, oh, they have a little free will, and I know it's a stupid thing, but
yeah,
that's what happens with that.
Yeah, that's sort of like being a little pregnant. Yeah, there's something weird about that. Like, I don't know. I mean, and of course, yeah, it's weird because I would like somebody to come up with 1% of anything that's free from causality or randomness.
Great point.
So, Trick, when you were mentioning internal influences, are you referring to like genetic predispositions, or what
Certainly,
exactly?
Genetic predispositions, just our brain structure in general, which holds memories and all these things from far past, influence our decisions. But those structures are built through causal mechanisms that lead outside of our influence. That is the point. So.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this is, like, for example, you guys tend to cover like the unconscious thing more than I do. And even though it's true that kind of destroys free will right then and there, I like to stick just to the causality for when I am explaining it to people, because that still covers all the bases, I think. When you realize that anything conscious or unconscious still had to come from something else that wasn't you, that happened before you were born, before you were conceived.
Yeah, I think the unconscious thing actually just kind of enforces what you just said, basically, because if our conscious thoughts are derived through a process that's unconscious, it's the same thing as our conscious thoughts being the product of something that we have no control over. So whether we stem to outside of, you know, our body or not, it still stems from unconscious processes. So
Right. And so what's really cool is that whichever explanation helps people get that they don't have a free will, that's what we want to use with them.
That's a great point, Chandler, because like, we're dealing with different personalities with different needs. And actually we got to that's something we haven't explored very, very much, very, very well. With each different person, like we kind of like, let's say we're involved in the debate with them, that we should get good at trying to like figure out, all right, what's their need for believing free will, and then just basically like, relate our explanation directly to their personal needs. Because as we were saying before, with different people, they're going to have different concerns.
Yes. Yeah, each person has their own needs, and it's sort of like, in our last podcast, we were talking about Slattery and his list of 10 things why it's hard for them to overcome the free will belief. And what we need to do is we need to work on the individual level, because we're being very general in our podcast, but when we're explaining this to individuals, the more you know about that person and their individual psychological needs, the more you can help them understand the benefits of not blaming themselves or attributing free will to themselves when it's completely insane.
So George, you gave your definition of free will. Why do you think that definition doesn't exist?
Well, all right, let's focus on the unconscious. Basically, free will is like that we are choosing what we choose, free of any factor that's not in our control. Okay, and so I think when we say that, we're saying that we consciously are choosing what we choose. And so then, like, you look at what consciousness most fundamentally is that it's awareness. I mean, like, there are about 20 different definitions, of unconscious, but the most general, the most accepted is that consciousness is simply awareness. Okay, now, so like, if consciousness is awareness, it's not decision making. So we're talking about choosing. So that gives you an idea, like, well, wait a minute, if consciousness isn't actually deciding, it's simply awareness, what is deciding? Then that leads us to the unconscious. And the first thing we realize about the unconscious is that we're not aware of it. That's why we call it the unconscious. Okay, and so then we look at the process of decision making. We have a decision, we have to base it on data, on information, on words, on concepts, on memories. And again, consciousness is awareness. It's not a data storage mechanism. So obviously all the data upon which we base a decision has to be stored in the unconscious.
Yeah.
Okay, so hold on. So you've got the unconscious as where all the data for making the decision is being stored. And again, our conscious mind is not aware of the unconscious. Then we also have the principles by which we make a decision. Is it a rational decision? Does it make sense? Is it a moral decision? Is it a right thing to do or not? Is it hedonic? Is it going to like make us happy or not? So like you've got these basic principles. And again, if the data upon which we're deciding is in the unconscious, that also tells you that the principles that have access to this data also have to reside in the unconscious. Okay, so and then the third component that's in the unconscious, so like you've got the data and the principles by which you decide, then we have the decision-making process. Okay, the mechanism that we actually decide upon. Again, if we go to our consciousness, we have to acknowledge that consciousness is simply awareness. It's not involved in actually doing any processing. So you have this third component of our decisions also necessarily having to reside in the unconscious, because the unconscious is the only part of our mind that has access to itself.
So let's simplify this down a little for people. Let's say someone has an apple and an orange, and they want to eat one of those. What is going on in their mind, and what processes are happening unconsciously that lead to the conscious process of choosing, say, an apple over the orange?
All right, so like they may be, again, the concepts of apple and orange are in their unconscious. And they're considering those. What also they're considering is like, well, which do I like better? And again, that's actually stored as a preference, as a memory. And that, again, consciousness is awareness, so that memory is also stored in the unconscious. So they're going to like evaluate like which to choose based on their preference. There might be other factors, of course, like maybe they had an apple for breakfast, so they, want an orange for lunch or something. But again, that's stored in the memory, and our memories are all stored in our unconscious.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
And so what you're saying, George, is basically that their unconscious is processing whether to eat an apple or an orange, and they become aware of which fruit they're going to eat, but then they pulled that decision out of nothing.
Chandler, when you think about it, our mind really is completely, in a sense, the unconscious. That's our mind. That's where the memories are. That's where the processing is. That's where the principles are. And so awareness, if you'll acknowledge, is simply the unconscious highlighting or focusing on a certain aspect of itself at any given moment, and these moments are like flowing like a river. They're our consciousness shifts from one cognition or impression or thought, whatever, to the next, but it's always the unconscious, just like as if it had a flashlight or something. It's highlighting an aspect of itself.
Right. Though I'd suggest that the conscious or the conscious interplays with the subconscious or the unconscious. Like, for example, if I eat an apple and I realize it's delicious, consciously, then that plays into my memory. That is an unconscious memory later on that influences the next conscious state of me taking the apple, correct?
Well, yeah, I think what happens is I think consciousness is a way for the unconscious to strengthen the, let's say, significance of something that they're perceiving. Because you have to, from priming experiments, you realize that like when we're seeing something consciously, our unconscious is also seeing it. So everything that our consciousness is doing, our unconscious is also aware of. So you're right. I think consciousness sometimes it's the unconscious's way of prioritizing, or just like making certain things within itself more important.
Right. Consciousness is the process by which the unconscious changes. New memories are stored.
Not always, but like usually, usually we want to become conscious of why we're doing things. Because, again, like with one of the reasons free will is impossible with these priming experiments, they put a photograph of a library in a room, and all of a sudden people in that room are talking more quietly, and then you'll ask the people, well, why were you talking more quietly? And they'll invent these reasons, that have nothing to do with the photograph on the wall.
Yeah, here's the deal though, George. They had to have been conscious of it for a brief moment to have seen the painting on the wall. They had to have seen it and been aware and then quickly forgot it somehow, that.
Chandler, no. According to research, basically, like we can, and this is like subliminal kind of like advertising and stuff. We can actually, our unconscious can perceive something, and we're like absolutely never conscious of it at all, but still our unconscious registers it.
I think technically that it's called subconscious. So you have unconscious, which means you have no consciousness whatsoever. You have subconscious, which means things are kind of playing in the background of your consciousness, but you're not really conscious of them. so you're seeing things, but you don't really recognize those in the forefront of your consciousness. They're just things that if somebody hypnotizes you later, you might be able to recall because you actually subconsciously got that data. So.
Right. I'm just saying that for even the unconscious to have information, it has to have been achieved through some sensory organ of something like that. I'm just
right.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so did we get off track or anything, David?
I think we did. I've forgotten what the topic was.
just debating whether why free will is impossible, basically.
Right, yeah. You guys went on to some kind of subconscious awareness.
Yeah, we're confusing David again. We need to let David talk. We won't shut up.
Yeah, so the topic was originally why we don't have free will, I think it was. So yeah, who wants to lay down the strongest argument against it?
Well, basically, causality, everything having a cause, or acausality, something happening for no reason at all, neither one are something that we chose. Whether there was true randomness, we didn't choose what randomly happened, and we also didn't choose the causes prior to our conception even, that now are causing us to do what we do. So that's why nobody's the first cause or the chooser without influence or anything. So it's totally impossible.
And Chandler, explain, most generally, like, what is causality? Because a lot of people, even academics, these guys with PhDs, they sometimes say they understand or accept causality, but they don't really understand it. So just explain what we mean when we say causality.
Well, for one thing, everything that happens has to have something prior to it that made it happen. And this is very important to understand, because anything you see, anything in TV, movies, video games, books, there had to be something that caused that person to write it or caused that person to draw something. And so I like to explain things in terms of change, in terms of evolution, because basically things like, for example, we know that a baseball doesn't just move on its own. There has to be some bat hitting it or a person throwing it. But it had, we don't view it as something that self causes itself to move. And yet, what people do, people who believe in free will, believe that people are totally, nothing is causing them to do what they do, and that they're doing their actions out of nothing. And so that's the thing. For example, I like to use the example of, My Little Pony did not come from nothing. The very concept of horses existed. Humans made a show about horses. It's very simple. So it's not like anything happens randomly in the sense of being uncaused. Now, I think causality is a concept that everyone gets at a deep level, and so when someone gets shot with a bullet, we wonder, well, where did the bullet come from? It came from a gun. Well, what caused the gun to shoot it? A human pulled the trigger. Well, what caused the human to pull the trigger? Well, they were mad at this person. Well, why were they mad at this person? Because this person didn't like My Little Pony. Or so, you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? And so it's just the infinite regress. And by the way, I'm not saying that we should shoot people who don't like My Little Pony. I'm just saying, that's just an example.
So, all right, but Chandler, you were dealing basically like, causes in a certain sense as reasons, but Trick, can you explain it more general in terms, for example, like the universe, the evolution of the states of the universe?
Well, we could say that causality is basically each moment in time taking place from the next. So if you have a static universe and just look at it from a overseer perspective or something, you would see one moment in the universe, the next moment in the universe. However, and they kind of blur into each other. It's not like they're separate things. It's that each moment in time influences the next moment in time, which influences the next moment in time.
And I would say not stronger than influence, causes. Like, for example, you have, let's say there was a Big Bang,
yes,
right?
That's what I mean. But we didn't want to use the word cause because we're already talking about trying to define cause.
Compels.
Yeah.
Necessitates. Yeah.
Necessitates would be the better word. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the idea. So in other words, like, any decision we make has to have a cause, because like to posit that it didn't have a cause is in a certain sense to posit that the universe didn't exist before, the decision, whatever.
Or it's to suggest that you have one moment in time and then the next moment in time with something added to that next moment in time that didn't come from the prior state, which is kind of bizarre if you think about it.
Yep. It is really bizarre when you put it that way.
in my experience, though, you can explain that to someone that, you know, the person doing something had a reason or a cause to do that, and they'll often ignore that and just focus on the act that that person has done, and they'll ascribe blame to that person purely on that basis. So how would you reply to someone like that?
Well, David, what I would do is, like, you're right. Some people don't get the logic of this, whether it's like, you know, causality, they're unconscious. So, like, basically just turning it over to them, challenging them, like, you know, say, well, if you have a free will, then why aren't you, for example, completely happy every moment of every day? Or why aren't you, like, you know, you value morality. If you have a free will, why aren't you, why do you occasionally do things that are immoral? So in other words, this is kind of like turning it on them in the sense that basically is based on their experience. You know, they'll quickly recognize, no, I can't be happy every moment of every day. No, I can't be good every moment that I would want. And like then, you know, it is a challenge at that point to get them to understand how that you know, means that they don't have a free will. But that's a way that's from their experience that's less conceptual.
Right, yeah.
And if we were looking at it from the perspective of the states of each universe being caused, we can kind of imagine that person within one state of the universe, imagine them in the next state of the universe doing something, next state of the universe, until they're deciding on whatever they're deciding on. So if they look at these pictures going back in time, they can recognize that decision that they made stemmed from all these other states of the universe. Now, if we say that there was some acausal event that changed them to make a different decision, then that's just kind of something jumping in there that wouldn't be from the prior state that has them in it. So it wouldn't be anything that they would have any control over either. So either way, you have that problem. But if everything's causal, then they can just imagine themselves being in one sheet of paper, for example, and then being in the previous sheet of paper and the previous sheet of paper that's played through time.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So, all right. Are there any other ways that we haven't covered yet? I remember I did an episode of my show once where there were like 10 different ways or something. I mean, like, does the fact that God, if you know, quote unquote, whatever, like, that, you know, theologically, if God doesn't have a free will, would that mean that we wouldn't have a free will either?
Well, it's kind of a weird thing because I don't. Yeah, that gets kind of strange. But the one thing that is clear is that we didn't create ourselves, and since we didn't create ourselves, that's another way of understanding we don't have a free will. Is that if we don't choose our desires in the first place that we start our life without, then how can we be said to be responsible for the actions that stem from those desires?
Oh yeah, we don't create our morality, we don't create our intelligence, we don't create, you know, all these kinds of like aspects of ourselves that ultimately, you know, basically make the decision for us, especially with a moral decision.
Right. And the notion that something outside of the universe, some supernatural thing or some God, gave us free will is just as logically incoherent as just us not having free will because of causality. There's no way to escape the causal or acausal dichotomy that leads to the logical conclusion that there's no free will. Even for the God itself, like there's no way that we can logically assess how a God could have the special free will because it's an illogical concept. So,
right.
So either the God is outside of logic, which and if we say that, then we have other problems because as soon as we say there's something that could be illogical, we basically can't identify anything. The law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, they all basically go out the window. So we can't even discern anything at all, including the God's existence.
Right.
So we have the whole problem there.
Yeah. So the whole problem can't even be discussed under that thing of being outside of logic.
Exactly. So either A, we're assessing things based on what is logical or reasonable, and if so, then even God himself couldn't have free will, or give somebody free will, or any system outside of the universe couldn't give us free will. So
Yeah, and we're a little past 30 minutes on my recorder here, so but I think we covered everything. So David, would you like to close it?
Sure, yeah, can do. Okay, you've been listening to the Science, Religion and Free Will podcast, and I've been trying to keep up, and I hope you join us next time. Thanks for listening.